Matthew Pennycook.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to wind up this debate for the opposition. And it's been a good debate. It was opened by the Environment Secretary, who made a powerful case for why a no-deal Brexit should be opposed, and by my right honourable and learned friend, the member for Holborn and St Pancras, who, as he always does, rose to the occasion with his usual rigour and honesty. It's been a good debate, as I said, Mr. Speaker, and among others, we've had passionate contributions from the right honourable gentleman, the member for Leeds Central, my right honourable friend, the member for Normanton, Pontefract and Castleford, the right honourable and learned gentleman, the member for Rushcliffe and Beaconsfield, and the honourable members for Birmingham, Yardley, East Surrey and Eddisbury, all of whom spoke with great force. Mr. Speaker, what I have taken from today's debate is that exiting the EU without an agreement is not simply one amongst several equivalent Brexit options. It is in a category of its own. Everyone will have their own views on the balance of strengths and weaknesses of other options, whether that be a Canadian-style free trade agreement or a Norway-style arrangement, and the appropriateness of the trade-offs and compromises involved in each. But those options can at least be contemplated rationally on the basis of their likely consequences for our economy and our security, their implications for the Irish border, and their chances of successfully emerging from the detailed negotiations on the future relationship. Mr. Speaker, in contrast, it is hard to overstate how damaging a no-deal exit from the EU in just over a fortnight would be, and speech after speech today has brought that home. A no-deal Brexit is simply not a viable option. Indeed, an exit from the EU on the 29th of March without agreement, or indeed any date thereafter, will be nothing short of a national disaster, a point that we on this side of the House have endlessly repeated over the past 2 years. A no-deal Brexit would affect every facet of our national life and every region and nation of the UK. It would bring to an end, at a stroke, the whole body of legal arrangements that exist between the UK and the EU, plunging us into a legal and regulatory vacuum. The focus of much of today's debate has rightly been on the impact of a no-deal Brexit on the economy, and for good reason, given the implications for businesses and individuals across the UK. The implications of crashing out without a deal on the 29th of March would be significant, both in terms of lost growth over the long term and the grievous dislocation that we face in the short term. The proposals for tariffs under a no-deal exit that the government published this morning, without any consultation with business, merely serve to underline what a disastrous outcome a no-deal exit would be. But, Mr. Speaker, the impact of a no-deal departure is about much more than just tariffs. It would mean a sudden and drastic change in the entire body of rules that currently govern how we trade in a range of crucial areas. It would threaten the complex law enforcement and judicial cooperation arrangements that keep Britain safe. It would almost inevitably result in infrastructure being placed on the Irish border, place untold strain on the Good Friday Agreement and Anglo-Irish relations more generally, and exacerbate the current political instability in Northern Ireland, raising the spectre, as the Secretary for the Environment said at the outset, of direct rule from Westminster. In short, Mr. Speaker, such an exit is the hardest and most chaotic of departures. It provides no certainty, and no one can say with any real certainty just how extensive the damage would be. Now, of course we'd survive, Mr. Speaker, but why would any government force the British people to cope with an entirely avoidable act of self-harm, which opinion polling suggests only a minority of the public support? No responsible government in their right mind should countenance a no-deal exit from the EU, especially when the other party, as the honourable member for East Surrey, who's not in his place, brought home in his contribution, when the other side knows full well that it has always been a hollow threat. And the tragedy is, Mr. Speaker, that instead of simply announcing that under no circumstances will the UK leave the EU without a deal, this government adopted such an outcome as their official plan B, endlessly repeating over months the nonsensical mantra that no deal is better than a bad deal, in a way that I believe desensitised many people in our country to the risks involved. And they've also spent, as the SNP spokesman said in his contribution, significant sums of public money trying to ensure they're prepared for it. And trying is the operative word, Mr. Speaker, because we know from the government's own impact assessment summary that the UK is simply not prepared to leave the EU on the 29th of March. Leave aside the legislative burden that still needs to be faced. Those impact assessments make clear that the departments are on track for just over 2/3 of the most critical projects. And it's honest about the fact that in the event of a no-deal exit, the UK would be at the mercy of the actions of the European Commission, EU member states and EU businesses. And that brings me to my next point, Mr. Speaker, which is that there is no such thing as a managed no deal.
Order. Order. There's a lot of background noise. I'm not sure the acoustics are as helpful as they might be, and I apologise, order, to the honourable gentleman for that, but can I urge him to project? Speak up, man. We want to hear you.
I should do my best, Mr. Speaker. It brings me to my next point. As I said, there is no such thing as a managed no deal, despite the protestations of the more cavalier members on the benches opposite. It is a myth, and it's why the idea of a no deal as an act of national liberation is so misleading. Not only would the government in all likelihood lose control of events in a no deal scenario, but it would inevitably end up supplicating itself before the EU. Just read the government's own technical notices. They make clear that in a swathe of areas, a no-deal scenario requires agreement from Brussels. And if anyone thinks amid the acrimony that would exist following a no-deal exit, that the EU is going to ride to the rescue and agree to a raft of reciprocal mini-deals in all the essential areas required, a waiver of the Union's rules, or a standstill transition period without a withdrawal agreement, as Amendment F suggests, just remind ourselves of the Commission's plans for no-deal exit. Those plans make absolutely clear that the EU will only agree to cooperative measures where strictly necessary, where it's in their own interests. They make clear that plans could not replicate the benefits of membership of the Union, and they state plainly that they could be revoked at any time. It's yet another example. I won't give way because I want to make sure the Secretary of State has sufficient time. It's yet another example, Mr. Speaker, of the misplaced confidence that has defined the approach of the hardliners on the benches opposite. And just like the notion of a cost-free, no-deal exit, it is a fantasy. And that is why so many honourable and right honourable members on the benches opposite, including many members of the Cabinet, know, whether they've said so publicly or not, that no-deal exit is not a viable option and it must be ruled out. Mr. Speaker, this House has already made its intentions clear in relation to a no-deal exit on 2 separate occasions. And I agree with the comments that have been made from all quarters today that it is disappointing the way that the government have framed their motion. At worst, it's contradictory. At best, it's ambiguous. And as the Right Honourable and Learned Member for Beaconsfield said, it certainly raises suspicions. It's of course a statement of fact that the current legal default remains that the UK leaves the EU on the 29th of March. And if we rule out a no-deal exit tonight, we'll of course have to amend the EU Withdrawal Act accordingly, just like we would have had to amend it if the government's deal had passed yesterday. And we will have to agree to an extension of the Article 50 process so that an alternative way forward can be found. Both are a given. But the only question before us this evening, Mr. Speaker, is does this House, in principle, definitively rule out a no-deal exit under any circumstances? No other question needs to be determined today, and that's why our preference is to support Amendment A. Mr. Speaker, there are only 16 days left now until the 29th of March. The possibility of a no-deal exit, whether by accident or design, is still very real, as the Father of the House made clear in his contribution. It is time we made a no-deal Brexit an impossibility, and this could be our last chance to do so. And that is why, Mr. Speaker, I urge honourable and right honourable members from across the House to decisively rule out a no-deal Brexit this evening so that we can turn our attention as a House tomorrow to shaping what happens next.
Secretary of State.